In a minute, Sister Hannah is going to start her program. And if you have any questions, go to the chat room and write them down, and we will get those at the end and ask her to respond to these questions.
Why aren't we hearing anything?
I'm going to tell you a little bit about Sister Hannah. She came to Sewanee 5 years ago to become a member of the community of St. Mary, Southern Province. Sister preaches in a variety of churches and schools and teaches adult forums. And as you would well know, since COVID, this work is mainly online. Sister Hannah came to the convent with a master's degree from the University of North Carolina, and she had a degree in nutritional sciences. She recently graduated from the University of the South School of Theology with a Master of Arts in Theology. Sister Hannah and the other sisters inherited the legacy and spirituality of Sister Constance and her companions. Together, they live a life of prayer and work in community as outlined by the Benedictine way. This order is particularly focused on stewardship of the earth, where gardening both beautifies and nourishes mind, body, and spirit. And I will turn this over to Sister Hannah.
Thank you so much, Joanne. And thank you to Joanne for the invitation to be with you all today. And thank you to Yane for doing all the behind the scenes Zoom work, and for Robin, who will be posting this video. So it does take a group effort on Zoom, just as it would in person. And I'm grateful for these wonderful women and for the invitation to be with you all. So instead of just hearing me go on in this format, I'm doing a combination of PowerPoint slides and 2 short videos. So I'm going to start sharing my screen now, and we'll just continue with this. So the topic for my presentation is Sister Constance and her companions. This is a portrait of Sister Constance, and you'll see later on in the presentation, we have a similar painting of her in the back of our chapel here in Sewanee, where I'm talking to you from, as our chapel here is dedicated to Sister Constance and her companions. And the emblem on this slide is the logo of our community. Just some background about Sister Constance. She was born in 1846 with the name Caroline Louise Darling. She was raised in Boston, Massachusetts, and she grew up Unitarian. She overcame opposition from her family to be baptized, and also had opposition from her family when she joined the religious life. She made her life profession of vows in 1871 in New York, and she was 25 years old. She chose the name Constance, and the order she chose was the order I am a part of, the Community of St. Mary. Now, at that time, the Community of St. Mary was a relatively new order. The founders pictured here, Mother Harriet Starr Cannon. If that name sounds familiar, she has her own feast day in the Episcopal Church on May 7th, and you can read more about her in the book, Holy Women, Holy Men. The community was founded in 1865 by Harriet Starr Cannon and 4 other women. It is the oldest Episcopal monastic order for women here in America. The sisters started a variety of charitable undertakings over the next years, including a home for fallen women, a hospital, a school for poor children, and an orphanage. In the year 1872, they acquired 30 acres in Peekskill, which was 40 miles north of New York City, and there they built the Mother House. A little background about Mother Harriet. She was born in Charleston, South Carolina. Her parents died of yellow fever when she was just a year and a half old. Her uncle raised her in Connecticut. This information about Harriet is key in the beginning of our discussion on the life of Sister Constance because it shows how deadly yellow fever can be. The photo that is on the slide here, we have the actual photo of in our convent here in Sewanee, as we are part of, as Joanne said, the legacy of the community of St. Mary. We are the southern province. There's also a western province in Wisconsin and an eastern province in New York. So we heard a little bit about the personal opposition Sister Constance had to overcome, but there was also opposition about just being an Episcopal nun and a nun. The only thing people knew about nuns was they had to be Roman Catholic. Even in the year 2021, when I say I'm an Episcopal nun, people just kind of laugh sometimes because they think I must be confused. I have to be Roman Catholic. So it's still one of the best kept secrets in the Episcopal Church. And hopefully with 75 people now logging on to hear this talk, you can spread the word that there are Episcopal nuns. When the order was formed, there was a lot of anti-Catholicism in America. There's that slogan, no king, no popery, and there was violence against Catholic immigrants. This book that's pictured here on the right is called The Awful Disclosures of Maria Monk, and this was the most widely read contemporary book in the United States before Uncle Tom's Cabin. It was published in 1836, and it had all these scandalous stories about inappropriate relationships between nun and priest. There was an inquiry that found no evidence to support the claims, but many American Protestants refused to believe that. There was violence against fully habited nuns in New England, and before the Civil War, nuns often didn't wear their habits in public or when traveling because of the hostility that they faced. In Indiana, children would throw rocks at them. In New England, there were anti-Catholic mobs that threatened to burn down convents and sometimes did burn down their convents. So people spoke against the community from the very beginning. So just by Sister Constance joining this community and being an Episcopal nun, she was facing opposition not only from her family, but from society. So how did she go from New York, where the Mother House was, to Tennessee? This is where Bishop Charles Todd Quintard comes in. In the year 1867, Bishop Quintard, the Bishop of Tennessee, was attempting to rebuild his diocese after the Civil War. He had been best friends with Mother Harriet in Connecticut, and so he turned to her for help. In 1872, Mother Harriet decided to make a full-scale foundation of the order in Memphis. In May of 1873, she named Sister Constance, who was 28 years old, as the superior of this new foundation. With her, she sent Sisters Amelia, Thecla, and Huetta to set up a school, and they were the flower of the sisterhood in their day. Bishop Quintard allowed them to turn his residence into the new school, as he was busy in Sewanee year-round, being the very first vice-chancellor of the University of the South, where I recently graduated from. The purpose in Memphis was twofold. First, to take charge of the church home, which was an orphanage that he had established as a home for orphans of the Civil War, and also the second one, to establish a school for girls. And this school is still in existence today. The school the sisters had established was all ready to start in October of 1873, but yellow fever broke out. The sisters asked for permission and were granted permission from the Mother House to remain in Memphis. And that when that was granted, they took charge of the sick in the Cathedral District. and cared for 60 patients, and only 8 died. In just 1 month, half of the city's 40,000 residents had fled. Of those remaining, 5,000 caught yellow fever and 2,000 died. The sisters worked from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. every day. They started each day with the Eucharist, and then they would go off to make house calls on the sick, whom their own families would not approach for fear of infection. As the epidemic gradually died out in November, the sisters stayed and cared for recuperating patients. These sisters were not nurses. They were trained to be teachers, but they adapted and learned all they could to care for the crisis that was around them. After November, the epidemic went away. They opened the school with 80 students, and all was going well for the next 4 years. But in the summer of 1878, Sisters Constance and Thecla went back to the mother house in New York for at last time for rest and retreat. They had only been back home for 2 weeks when on August 15th, 1878, news arrived that Memphis was yet again having another yellow fever epidemic. Sisters Constance and Thecla left within 1 hour of receiving the telegram. When they arrived in Memphis on August 20th, they rejected offers to take up residence in the countryside where it was safe, and immediately returned to Memphis to their convent and turned it into a dispensary. By the time they returned, Memphis was a ghost town. Panic spread throughout Memphis, and at least 2 people were trampled to death at the railroad platform as crowds rushed to flee the city. Almost everyone who could afford to do so left, and others fled to higher ground away from the river. Within 10 days of the first yellow fever death this year, more than half the population fled. They left by every possible means available, by carriages, buggies, wagons, furniture vans, and street days. People left on anything that could float on the river and by railroads. This stream of passengers seemed endless, and they seemed to be as mad as there were many. This epidemic so depopulated the area that the city lost its charter and was not reorganized again for another 14 years. Although about 25,000 people were able to leave, left behind were some 20,000 men, women, and children who did not have the means to leave. Shops and offices were boarded up, houses were locked and shuttered, and an eerie silence smothered the city, broken only by the occasional booming of cannons that were fired to break up supposed poisons in the air, and the steady noise of wagons or carts hauling along caskets. At night, smoldering fires of burning bedding and clothing, the last belongings of fever victims, lit the night sky and shadowed on volunteers who went from house to house to care for the sick. Victims dropped dead in the streets, and bodies were discovered each morning in the city parks. Editorials in the local newspaper, the Daily Avalanche, were still publishing, though most of its staff had come down with the fever. And these quotes share the deadly progress of the epidemic. On August 30th, they wrote, "We are doomed. It is hard, as we write in this dark, dismal hour of death, not to realize the full meaning of that brief sentence." On September 1st, they wrote, "The King of Terrors continues to snatch victims with fearful rapidity. 3 short weeks ago, our city was active with businesses of all classes. Now, our streets are deserted, our stores and residences empty." And their last entry, September 5th, "Great God, how his murderous work has increased. Those that are left are busy burying the dead." A citizens' relief committee organized refugee camps, and nurses and doctors within Memphis were assigned to infected districts, reportedly seeing as many as 100 to 150 patients each day. There were in the city several communities of nuns, both Anglican and Roman Catholic, who had the opportunity to leave, but chose to stay. Most of them, 38 in all, were killed by the fever. Sister Constance wrote in her diary that this 1878 version was far worse than that of the 1873 epidemic. Towards the end of August, the death rate was running at 70 a day. In house after house, sisters found victims, often abandoned, alone, unconscious, and without medical care. It was impossible to find nurses. Many doctors had fled the city, as had most clergy. Sometimes it took a police order even to get an undertaker's services. This epidemic was the 5th yellow fever epidemic to hit Memphis. It was a prime location for this disease. When the Mississippi River flooded, bottomlands to the north and south of the city turned into breeding grounds for the Aedes aegypti mosquito, which was the carrier of the yellow fever. One doctor later observed that the 1878 epidemic struck Memphis with unusual malignity and unusual rapidity. Often the first symptom was a little more than a slight chill. Within hours, victims would suffer headaches and temperatures as high as 106. They would get a wildly erratic pulse and a yellowish tinge to the skin and eyeballs. A patient at this stage, reported one doctor, is restless, sighs, screams, attempts to get up, falls about half conscious, and can't tell why he can't sit still. Blood would ooze out of the skin, and the last stage of the disease was black vomit. After that, death would come within days, sometimes hours. And doctors had no clue how to cure it. All they knew was that it came in the summer and faded in the fall. I'd like to share a video with you all now about the disease.
It's a hemorrhagic fever, which puts it in the same category as Ebola. It was gruesome. People's eyes, ears, mouths, anything could bleed because the virus was attacking the blood vessels. And internally, the same thing was happening. So one of the most common symptoms of so there was a lot of delirium that went on with it, which I think was very disturbing to the people caring for yellow fever victims. And the last organ usually to fail was the liver, and when it did, it releases a surge of bile, which turns the jaundice, the body and whites of the eyes yellow. In the body's attempt to fight off this virus, it caused these high fevers. So it was typical to see a fever at 105, 106. Some of the Memphis doctors who were performing autopsies during the epidemic said that it felt like the organs had literally were boiling at the time of autopsy.
Memphis was no stranger to yellow fever. The grim disease had visited the city at least 3 times in its history. In mid-June of 1878, word came upriver confirming that yellow fever was in New Orleans. That same month, Dr. Robert Wood Mitchell, one of 3 doctors on the Memphis Board of Health, called for money to initiate a quarantine. But a quarantine would have done nothing to stop disease-carrying mosquitoes from entering the city. 19th century medicine had no knowledge or tools to cope with such an invasion. They believed that the disease was caused by poisonous miasmas that emanated from the Gayoso Bayou. On August 13th, the Board of Health announced the first yellow fever death in Memphis.
But that official case is really what marked this mass exodus out of the city. And people described it just as, they would get on anything that would float in the Mississippi. They would get on the trains, wagons, anything they could to get out of the city as quickly as possible. Some people left doors open and their tables still set with silver, was how one person described it. So with a population of about 40 to 45,000, they estimated 25,000 people fled, about half the population at the time, and this was in a matter of 3 days.
The remaining population of some 19,000 people were witness to a daily roll call of the dead that wouldn't stop until the arrival of the first frost.
My darling little daughter, we are in the midst of death and desolation. Today we are alive, but tomorrow may find us dead, victims of one of the most terrible plagues that ever desolated any country. Nothing seems to stop the progress of this grim destroyer. Frost is our only hope, which seems far in the distance. Julia Rain.
Here you have like this picture of heavy plumes of smoke going up in the air. Had a strong smell to it. Dead bodies, coffins out, waiting to be picked up. People avoiding contact with other people, armed people, and the cannon firing. It had to be, again, reminiscent of Dante's Inferno.
It got really just horrific in the city itself. The undertakers were burying people in mass graves because they couldn't keep up with the bodies that were coming through. They would locate bodies by buzzards, anything they could, just throughout the city. And a lot of the houses had been marked they would hang up a piece of cardboard, a black piece of cardboard for someone who had died, and put the dimensions of the coffin needed. So a couple of times a day, the undertaker would come through the city and round up the bodies and put them in the coffins and take them to Elmwood and put them in the big mass grave that has close to 1,500 unidentified bodies in it now.
Medical science of the 19th century had no clue as to the cause of yellow fever, and few weapons with which to fight a disease that could kill within a matter of hours.
And there were several Memphis physicians, Dr. Robert Wood Mitchell, Dr. Gustavus Thornton. Dr. Thornton said, you gave him a good emetic, that is, you gave him a good cleaning out, and then you gave him fluids and total bed rest and nothing else.
I think for the doctors, a lot of it just was managing these houses. They would enter a house and find the father and the mother dead in the bed with the children, sick on the floor, and would not know how many hours or days that the children had been left unattended. It was just horrific all around. So a lot of what the doctors did was just feed people, take them water, and get the undertakers to remove the bodies.
By early September, the disease was averaging 200 deaths per day. Coffins were stacked on the streets awaiting burial. Fever fires burned, and in the distance was the sound of cannons being fired across the Gayoso Bayou in an effort to clear the air of poisonous miasmas. It was said you could smell death from 3 miles outside the city limits.
It taxed every resource that was available. Doctors made house calls just night and day, and a number of the volunteer doctors who came here in 1878 died because they themselves contracted yellow fever, and they were exhausted.
111 physicians were under the direction of Dr. Robert Wood Mitchell of the Howard Association. Many of these doctors were volunteers from as far away as New York. And 3,000 nurses, many of them African American, assisted as best they could. One of the Howard physicians was Dr. William J. Armstrong, a survivor of the 1873 epidemic, who wrote letters to his wife and 8 children who had fled Memphis at the onset of the disease. From Dr. Armstrong's letters, we can envision a city gripped by fear and despair.
August 24th, my dearest one. The outlook grows more gloomy each day and gives no promise of a break short of frost. What a fight it will be, and how ceaseless. No one but the poor worn-out physicians know what it is. Kiss my dear children for me. And I do hope God will spare us all to meet at the old fireside soon.
He wrote these very touching letters to his wife throughout the epidemic. He was helping take care of the nuns and the St. Mary's community there that had set up sort of a makeshift hospital, mainly for the orphaned children, a lot of the children that were left behind when their parents died.
September 3rd. I do not see how it is possible for me to work through it all. How I did it before, I do not know, but this is worse than all. The numbers of deaths as reported are frightful. Yesterday, 208. But that is simply the accumulation of what Jack Walsh could not bury, and not the deaths for that day. Some of the bodies lie 3 and 4 days unburied and produce horrid smells in the locality. I wish I could go to some secret spot where there would be no burning heads and hands to feel, nor pulses to count. It is fever, fever, all day long.
The altruistic spirit of medicine is embodied in the bravery of the doctors, nurses, and volunteers who fought the fever. Of the 111 Howard physicians, 54 were stricken by the disease, and 33 died.
September 10th. One by one, the Howards and the doctors are falling. Out of 5 of us at the drugstore, Dr. Sam and A.B. are in Virginia. Humes is dead, and Channing down with a pretty bad case. September 11th. My dearest one, it is now nearly 9 o'clock, and I have just gotten in. Channing is very low tonight, and I fear the worst will come. Of all the 5, I alone am standing.
Those words ended Dr. Armstrong's last letter. He took ill with the fever on September 16th and died 4 days later on the 20th. He was buried in Elmwood Cemetery. On the night of October 18th, the long-prayed-for killing frost arrived. Of the 19,000 people who had stayed in Memphis, an estimated 17,000 contracted yellow fever, and 5,150 died.
The numbers of deaths were higher than the Chicago fire, the San Francisco earthquake, and the Johnstown flood combined. And to even put that in perspective today, more people died in that epidemic than we lost on 9/11. More people died in that epidemic than Pearl Harbor, and more people died than Hurricane Katrina.
In many ways, the old river town that was Memphis died in 1878 and would be replaced by a new city that grew up in the 1880s.
Okay, just bear with me as I'm working out the logistics of sharing the screen. Okay, thank you for your patience. Sister Constance and her sisters set up a soup kitchen, and they began 24-hour visits to families hit by the fever. The Citizens Relief Organization asked the sisters to open the Canefield Asylum outside of town as a refuge for children who were orphaned by the disease. When Sister Constance a few days later attempted to take children there, she met an angry mob. They were terrified that the nuns were bringing infection into their neighborhood. Sister Constance faced them down and said, "Sirs, is it possible that you would have us refuse to these children the very protection you have obtained for your own? We do not propose to make a hospital of the asylum." The angry men let her pass. Within 4 days, Sister Constance and her sisters had placed more than 50 orphans there. We know from the diary that she kept these words: "Yesterday, I found 2 young girls who had spent 2 days in a 2-room cottage with the bodies of their parents, their uncle suffering in delirium. One grows perfectly hardened to these sights. Carts with 8 or 9 corpses in rough boxes are ordinary sights. I saw a nurse stop one day and ask for a certain man's residence. The driver pointed over his shoulder and said, "I've got him here in his coffin." 2 more sisters were sent to Memphis in August, Sisters Helen and Sister Ruth. When Sister Constance received the telegram from the mother house with this announcement, she wrote to Mother Harriet with these words: "My dearest mother, your telegram brought me a kind of brightness, but I cannot help a great deal of anxiety for Sisters Helen and Ruth. My sense of duty in the matter is so divided between the feeling that I ought to secure all the help I can get for these poor suffering people and the fear for those who come. I will guard them to the utmost, but you and I know that they are offering their lives." Sisters Ruth and Helen joined Sister Constance and the others. When the 2 new sisters arrived in Memphis, the new nuns probably felt they had come to hell on earth. "The city is desolate," wrote Sister Ruth. "Everyone who is not ill says it is only a matter of time. Money is useless. There is plenty of money here, but it buys no hands to wash nor the common necessities of life. Doctors and nurses died one by one, and the pharmacies closed. It was becoming impossible to get the most basic items. We are helpless and do not know what to do, nor how help can come," wrote Sister Ruth. "There are nearly 50 children here now. We have no clean clothes. It is utterly impossible to get any washing done. There is no one to send for supplies, and no stores are open." As the death toll rose to 200 a day, the situation grew more and more hopeless. Their companion, the Reverend Charles Carroll Parsons, wrote to the bishop. "It is impossible," he wrote. "Go and turn the destroying angel loose upon a defenseless city. Then you will see how Memphis is." The hard work took its toll. On September 2nd, Father Parsons became ill with the fever and was put to bed. Sister Constance visited him and wrote, "He was very cheerful. I offered to do him some little service, such as fanning him or putting up the mosquito net, but he said quickly, 'No, no, I beg you not. Indeed, I could not let you fatigue yourself.' I looked at his nurse. She whispered, 'Let him have his way. I never saw anyone so unselfish as he is.'" She wrote later, "Parsons had a chill this evening. I shall know before 12 whether it was the chill." Her fears were soon confirmed. The sisters watched over Father Parsons fretfully. Father Parsons died, having read his only commendatory prayers because there was no other priest around. His last words were, "Lord Jesus, receive my spirit." He died on September 7th. Father Louis Schuler reported for duty in Memphis after Father Parsons had died. Instead of staying in a hotel outside of the fever district, he insisted on remaining at St. Mary's so he could go to the very thick of the pestilence in the lower portion of the city. After just 4 days of constant labor, he fell ill with the fever and died on September 17th at the age of 27. Sister Constance and her companions are also known as the Martyrs of Memphis, and these are their names and the dates they died. After Father Parsons died, Sister Constance contracted the fever. Another sister summoned the doctor. "I have not the fever," Sister Constance protested. "It is just a bad headache. It will go away at sunset." Sister Ruth tried to put Sister Constance to bed, but she refused. She said, "It is the only comfortable bed in the house, and if I have the fever, you will have to burn it." So she spent the night lying on the bare floor. Within the hour, Sister Thecla came to the church after a visit to a poor woman and told the sisters, "I am so sorry, sisters, but I have the fever. Give me a cup of tea and I shall go to bed." By the next morning, both sisters were dreadfully ill. Sister Constance became delirious. Sister Ruth wrote, "All through that night, I could hear from my room her low moan. At about midnight, she exclaimed, "Hosanna," repeating it again and again more faintly. That was her last word. On the morning of September 9th, Sister Ruth reported that Sister Constance's soul had entered the paradise of perfect love. Sister Ruth wrote, "Sister Constance was 33 years old when called away, a woman of exquisite grace, tenderness, and loveliness of character, very highly educated, and one who might have adorned the most brilliant social circle. All that she had, she gave without reserve to her Lord." Sister Thecla died a few days later on September 12th. Sister Ruth was the next victim. Just 26 years old, she had been a nun only a year. But in that 1 year, wrote another sister, she brought comfort to so many suffering ones and helped lead back those who had strayed far out of the way. Many of the poor speak of her as the sunbeam that came to brighten their lives. Sister Ruth died on September 17th. Sister Frances had been in charge of the orphanage home, a task that grew more difficult when the other sisters became ill. She caught the fever in August but recovered, but then had a relapse on October 1st, and she died on October 4th, the feast of St. Francis. "The children were all so fond of Sister Frances," wrote one of the sisters. "The oldest boy goes out by himself to lay flowers on the grave, and he stands looking pitifully upon it." These 6 individuals became known as the Martyrs of Memphis. If you go to Elmwood Cemetery today in Memphis, these 4 names and dates are carved around the perimeter of the flat stone: Constance, Thecla, Ruth, and Frances, and the day they died. 9 years later, after the death of Sister Constance, another sister in the order, Sister Isabel, who had been ill for a year with a long and painful illness, told the sisters that she had seen Sister Constance in her room near her bed on November 15th. Some days later, after a night of great suffering, she said that Sister Constance had come to her again and sat beside her and soothed her pain. And when she asked Sister how long she had to live, Sister Constance told her until Christmas. "I had hoped to make my communion on Christmas," Sister Isabel said. "You will do so," came the answer. When she expressed the fear that her death would cast a cloud on the children's festivities, she was told, "You will not die till late on Christmas night, and before that you will be better and suffer less, and the time will not seem long." And her words came true. I personally have been told another Sister Constance ghost story when I went to Memphis. A friend of mine was working at St. Mary's Cathedral in Memphis, where Sister Constance worked. And one day she continued to smell white roses. There was a painting of Sister Constance on display in the middle of the cathedral that day. My friend went all around throughout the cathedral to see if there was a shipment of flowers that had been delivered, but she didn't find any. As she approached the painting of Sister Constance, the smell of roses grew stronger and stronger. She later learned that Sister Constance was buried with a white rose on the top of her body, and my friend knew that it was the spirit of Sister Constance paying her a visit. Bringing it down to today's 2021 memorial and what we normally do in the past few years before COVID, there is an ongoing commemoration of Sister Constance and her companions. If you go to St. Mary's Cathedral in Memphis, in the fellowship hall type area, it's called Martyrs Hall. As you see, there's a drawing there of Sister Constance, and you can see history literally written on the walls. Their story and pictures are there in detail if you ever are in town to look at that. This is a stained glass inside St. Mary's Cathedral in Memphis, memorializing the sacrifice of the sisters who labored there. It's beautiful to see in person. At the high altar of the cathedral, which was consecrated on Pentecost 1879, Bishop Quintard commissioned these steps to be carved with the Sisters of St. Mary who died. Sister Huetta, who died in 1922, was added later on. At the high altar up top is inscribed Alleluia Hosanna, which were the very last words of Sister Constance. A friend of the community, Father Morgan Dix, wrote, "Before the memorable year 1878, many spoke against these faithful and devoted women. But after that year, the tongue of slander was silent. Men looked on with beating hearts, and their eyes were dim with tears." If it wasn't the pandemic, one of the sisters, or as many as we could spare, would go to Memphis for the Martyrs Weekend. It's held every year from September 9th through 11th. September 9th is the feast day of Sister Constance. And there's a reading of some of the journal entries from Sister Constance and other companions. There's always the Eucharist at the cathedral on that Sunday, and sometimes a sister preaches. There's a procession to the graves at Elmwood Cemetery, and it's just a very, very powerful and moving weekend. If any of you all are in the area, are interested in going, you can read more about that online or just contact me. There's also a pilgrimage picnic. And so you go out to the graves and there's a service there, and then you go back in the cathedral and there's a picnic afterwards and fellowship. And one of the most moving parts of being out at the graveside is, as a sister, I and the others get to place a single white rose on the top of every sister's grave. It's very, very moving. These are pictures of non-pandemic times where people would make the procession to Elmwood Cemetery. Now I wanted to show you a virtual tour of the cathedral. Also in Memphis, they have the Spirit of the Sisters Neighborhood Health Fair. So different volunteers go to volunteer in the areas the sisters minister to in Memphis. They give away free blood pressure screenings, diabetes screenings, and so they continue to, as the title says, carry the spirit of the sisters in these same areas they lived and worked in. And I wanted to elaborate on the connection to today. The only sister that worked with Sister Constance in Memphis that survived was Sister Huetta. Her last name was Snowden. She was of a prominent family in Memphis. And she and her family had a summer house in Sewanee. And so the sisters would go on retreat to Sewanee, and eventually we established an order in Sewanee. In Sewanee, they established St. Mary's School for Girls, and that is back in the day when they had those really sweet winged nun outfits there. And so they established a school in Sewanee. So that's how we moved from Memphis to Sewanee. And that was in the year 1888, also under the direction of Bishop Quintard, to create this preparatory school. The school closed in 1968, and the remaining students were transferred to Sewanee Academy. But I am glad that we are still in existence in Sewanee. The school building was repurposed and made into a retreat center as pictured here. And the sisters ran it for a time, but again in the 1970s sold it, but it is across the street from our convent here in Sewanee. And this is our convent chapel. It was built in 1989 and still looks pretty much the same. This is the inside of our chapel. And so we did a widescreen photograph so you can see the different places where we sit and the altar and the banners and cloths there. And if it's not COVID, please come and visit us. This is our beautiful portrait of Sister Constance that we have in the back of our chapel, because our chapel is dedicated to Sister Constance and her companions. And so no matter where you are in the chapel, you can feel Sister Constance watching over you. The ombre that Sister Constance and the other sisters used in Memphis, we inherited in our chapel in Sewanee. So it's really nice to have that piece of history that we get to see and touch every day. The chalice that Sister Constance and the others used, we also have at our chapel in Sewanee. We call it the Memphis chalice, and we only use it on special feast days. In our convent library, we have a portrait of Sister Huetta, who is watching over us in there. And so it's nice to have that other piece of history in our convent. This is one of my favorite pictures. So now we have 4 sisters, but this time we only had 3. And the middle is Sister Elizabeth, and on the right is our prior, Sister Madam Mary. And the woman is Bishop Phoebe Ruth, the Bishop of Western Tennessee. And the tall gentleman is Bishop Brian Cole of East Tennessee. So I wanted to take this picture when both bishops came, because you have the Bishop of East and West and us continuing this history of the story of the bishops of Tennessee and the sisters. And then you have the portrait of Sister Constance in the background. So I just really love this photo. This stained glass is from All Saints Chapel in Sewanee, Tennessee. So if you ever are on campus and look at this magnificent chapel, you can see that even there, that story is a part of the history. In the video, the first video we watched, they mentioned a mass grave, and they built a memorial in 1971 for this site and dedicated it the Yellow Fever Martyrs Memorial Park and Mass Grave. At the center is this eye-catching memorial consisting of 2 pillars that depict the body of the deceased rising towards heaven. And a plaque at the bottom says, "For the heroes and heroines of Memphis who gave their lives serving the victims of yellow fever." The feast day of Sister Constance and her companions in the Episcopal Church is September 9th. This is the prayer that goes with it. We give you thanks and praise, O God of compassion, for the heroic witness of the Martyrs of Memphis, who in a time of plague and pestilence were steadfast in their care for the sick and dying, and loved not their own lives, even unto death. Inspire in us one God, now and forever. Bishop Quintard, in his reflection on this story, says, "The story of Memphis is a reflection of the story of Calvary. The love of Jesus Christ in the fullness of its constraining power is exhibited in those who, having forsaken all to follow and possess him, shrank not from the supreme test of their sincerity, but laid down their lives at his bidding. That love should speak to our hearts as we read these fruits of divine faith. Our own love should kindle, and our faith should be strengthened. The supernatural world is brought very near to us. It seems more real for a season than this." Thank you.
Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. It's very moving, and the story is just a very moving story. Susan Katz had asked on chat who was the name of the woman who wrote the book, and Yane had said Molly Caldwell Cosby, The American Plague.
Oh, yes, that's in the video.
Is she in any way connected to you all?
Not, but the second woman that spoke, Patricia McFarland, she's one of our associates. So we do have a connection with the other speaker.
Excellent. Someone else, Benny Wooten, asked, was the yellow fever contagious or only contracted through the insect bites? And I know it's only through insect bites, but how did they, do you know how they stopped it?
I don't know. I haven't read up about that as much.
Okay. Okay, and Joan Gunderson would like to know, are the two priests also memorialized?
They are. They have a separate grave. It's also in Elmwood Cemetery. I don't have pictures of those, but they are buried nearby the sisters.
Are they connected? Is it connected to St. Mary's also?
It's within walking distance of the sisters' graves in Elmwood.
Okay. Were they connected to the cathedral at all? Or
one of them was a rector of Grace Church, which was a church in Memphis, and the other one was a volunteer that came from New York, actually.
Gotcha. Okay, and someone else asked about getting to see these, and Yane has put on the chat room anybody who missed the first one or the second one or would like to see this one again. They are on our YouTube channel, which is listed in the chat room. So lots of wonderful comments, how moved everyone was by this wonderful presentation. Thank you so much.
If you know of anybody interested in joining religious life, please come. We are a community of 4. We also do an internship program for the summer and long term. So if you know of any college students or recent college graduates, we do have an internship program. And I will give Yane the link to our website, and so you can look at that for further information. But if it's not COVID, please come and visit. We do have guest accommodations. So if it's your bucket list dream to spend a night at a convent, we do have guest accommodations. So I really wish there was more time to speak to you all individually.
And I can say that in non-COVID times, I am a priest at the altar. On Wednesday mornings, there are several of us who rotate through, and it is a very wonderful experience to be connected to these prayerful, wonderful women. Thank each and every one of you for being here and listening to the presentation. And I ask, as Hannah does, that you contact them, or if you want, just come to the September 9th weekend festivities in Memphis. And you'll be glad that you did. So thank you, everyone, and we hope to see you next week when we will, I want to get her name right, we will hear about the music of Ray Whitney. Thank you, and go in peace to love and serve the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Good job.